let's talk a little bit about this. So this is an idea about a couple of cultural dimensions, and the first one is power distance. And by this, what was meant was, how much do we have of this, from a high power strata of society to a low power. So if there's a big difference in stratas of power, we consider that a high power distance cultural dimension. So, there's people in charge, and then there's, peons, and there's quite a gap in between. So if we have a culture like that, the indicator says that if there's a high power distance, then, we have, for example, a chairman that will be in control of the technology, and that in order for other participants to come in, that they have to request, permission, if you will. So if you think that's a high kind of centralized control type of deal in the technology. On the individualism scale, so what we're talking about there is that do we tend to think of things in terms of highly individualistic processes? We think of America, for example, as indicator of a high individualism versus low individualism. It's much more community-oriented, communal. So if you think about it, for the low individualism, then we're talking about how do we group people together? How do we work as not so much the individual, but as groups of people? And then on the high individualism side, how do we allow for individuals to set some of their own issues? So the example is allowing side chatting, but also knowing that there's high individualism, we also need a tool that allows us to get convergence, since that's a potential issue with a lot of individuals. On the masculinity dimension, kind of interesting. You probably know what we're talking about, but in cultures where there's definitely huge gender role differentiation, and typically it's the males that, again, dominate the female, what we have to be careful about, and where we see that, is that if we do actually expect and hope for, if you will, for our our female members, we probably need to think about a tool that allows us to kind of reduce that dominant aspect. And one of the suggestions is, that we agree upon and allow for limited speaking time, so that it can't be dominated. Uncertainty avoidance, sort of the risk kind of thing. Are we a risk-oriented process, or do we really think in terms of rule-based? So if we're a high rule-based kind of thing, then we probably need to make sure that we have tools with clearly defined roles and processes associated with them. Who speaks first, those kinds of things. And then long-term orientation. It's also saying in terms of, what do we value more, the existing situations, or are we more likely to look for different situations? Again, it's also, in a sense, sort of, am I a status quo, or am I looking for new things? So if we're low on the long term, in other words, I am looking for new stuff, then we suggest that the tool supports that. But also, again, thinking about how do we make sure that we just don't keep doing things for the novelty's sake. So again, trying to bring it back into realistic aspects of it. So just a few ideas about a few areas of cultural differences and how the tools might reflect that based on some ideas about that particular culture. So think about your culture, or the cultures you're familiar with. You might think of it in terms of, again, your national culture, your organizational culture, your functional culture. So think about it in some of the ways that we've been talking about it in this class. And I suggest one of the things you do as a team, discuss this. So in terms of these ideas, where would your organization that you're affiliated with run on that scale? So why don't you pause at this point and think about that. Here's a team culture profile. Again, this is in your handout. This is just as you start thinking about your team, as you start forming your team, one of the processes you do is maybe just do this quick little profile. And this can form a basis by which a discussion starts about who we are, who do we want to be, how do we want to behave. Some skill sets, just a few examples. You look at the team leader competencies, coaching and managing without traditional forms, selecting and appropriately using electronic communication and collaboration, leading cross-culturally, helping to develop and transition team members in and out of the team, and then building and maintaining trust. Now, if you think about that, these are the same skills we always think about in terms of team leads. But now we're sort of also putting a special emphasis on that now that we're in the virtual, non-co-located phase. And of course, team members, again, very similar ideas, except that, working across boundaries, personal awareness, those things are even more emphasized here as we work in the virtual. This is just a couple of ideas. So networking. One of the things about working virtually is this idea of having relationships between groups and between individuals. So you might want to just think about, as you work in a team, are you really working as a team? In other words, people that are part of a network with relationships, or in fact, are your relationships relatively weak and you're just working as individuals? So if the idea is you are working on teams, here's a few ideas to think about before, during, and after a particular session. Cool quote. If we use technology poorly, it may have no advantage with no technology at all. And in fact, we've seen things, it makes it worse. In some ways, having these rapid forms of communication, so we are in fact interacting with each other probably at an unprecedented scale, but that interaction may in fact, if we don't factor in these cultural differences and be aware of it, that they're differences and not necessarily right or wrong, that I'm right, you're wrong, you're right, I'm wrong kind of thing. It can actually have some negative impact. And I just say, we've seen this. I probably mentioned this story before, working with a big technology firm with a big subsidiary in Japan. And interestingly enough, the biggest conflict on a couple of projects was between the local headquarters here in Silicon Valley and the people working on the project that were coming from their subsidiary in Japan. There was just this huge difference in work style, with the American side being sensed by the Japanese as being horribly rude and insensitive and this kind of stuff, whereas the American side, looking at their Japanese counterparts, are saying these guys just don't step up. I don't know if they're slow or stupid or quiet or what, but if they don't start stepping up, this project just isn't going to work. So it took in fact, we're still working on that. It's a big issue for them to kind of resolve, and in a sense, the technology even exacerbated that issue.